Thanks so much for coming today to the book talk with Katie Gee Salisbury. I'm Mila Zuo. I'll be moderating the Q&A. And I just want to say before we begin, I want to acknowledge that we're gathered here on the unceded, ancestral, and traditional lands of the Musqueam people, and we're so privileged and honored to be here today. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker and our visitor today. So, Katie Gee Salisbury is the author of Not Your China Doll, a new biography of Anna May Wong, the first Asian American movie star. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Vanity Fair, The Believer, the Asian American Writers Workshop, and elsewhere. She was a finalist for the Jerome Hill Artist Fellowship in 2021 and gave the TED Talk As American as Chop Suey. She also writes the newsletter Half-Caste Woman, a fifth-generation Chinese American who hails from Southern California. She now lives in Brooklyn. With that, I'd like to welcome Katie up to the podium.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here today, and to everyone who came to hear a little bit about Anna May Wong. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of Anna May Wong's life and career today. So I'm going to try to zip through it in about 25 to 30 minutes. So if I go long, someone tell me to go faster. But yeah, Anna May Wong was a fascinating woman, someone I've been thinking about for the last 20 years. Who was she? So she was born Wong Liu Song in 1905 in Los Angeles. Her Chinese name translates loosely to Frosted Yellow Willows. She was the daughter of a laundryman, and both of her parents were actually born in Northern California. So it was her grandparents who immigrated from China to the US around the time of the gold rush, making her what I would consider a third-generation Chinese American. She was also the first American-born actor of Asian ancestry to play a leading role in a Hollywood production. And across her 4-decade career, she really worked in every single medium. She started in silent films, transitioned to talkies. She also did radio, live theater, as well as television in the 1950s. And of course, throughout that run, she broke a lot of historic firsts. So Anna May Wong grew up in a very close-knit, they weren't technically immigrants themselves, but, during that period, there was a lot of isolation between different ethnicities and races. So she was very much growing up in the Chinese American community with a working class family. Her father operated a laundry in downtown Los Angeles, so not far from Chinatown. So Anna May Wong is actually the woman in the far right corner. She's standing behind her father, Wong Sam-sing, and her oldest sister, Lulu, is on the far left. They were very close in age and also very close as sisters. They shared a lot of formative experiences, one of which was being chased home by their white classmates as young girls because they were Chinese, having racial slurs shouted at them, their pigtails pulled. So certainly a very memorable experience. But they were also doing a lot of other things. As children of a working class family who runs a small business, they helped out at the business. So whenever they weren't at school, they were helping out at the laundry. And during this time in their early childhood was also the time period when film studios that had just started operating in New York and New Jersey started moving out to the West Coast in Los Angeles. They'd realized they could shoot all year round in LA because the weather was so great and they had such diverse terrain. So Anna May, as a young girl, notices these film crews setting up in the streets of downtown Los Angeles, and very often in Chinatown because it's free atmosphere. They don't have to build a set. They can just show up and start filming. And she's really captivated by what they're doing. And pretty soon she starts skipping school, saving tip money from the laundry delivery she's helping to make, or her lunch money, so that she can go to the movies and stay and just watch the reels from end to end. And then she would race home and try and reenact the things she'd just seen in front of the mirror. So that was her first brush with movies. By age 11, so pretty young, she's already decided that she's going to become a movie star. So she gets her foot in the door pretty early on at 14 as an extra in a film called The Red Lantern with Alina Zomova, who was a big star at the time. She's like one of 3 lantern carriers, although when she goes to see the film, she doesn't know which one is her. Of course, she's just a glorified extra, but that leads to other bit parts, and pretty soon she's getting credited supporting roles. So the article on the far left is actually one of her first printed interviews in the Los Angeles Times. I believe it's from 1921. And I think one of the things that was really interesting to look at some of her early interviews is the way that reporters approached her. They didn't really know what to expect from Anna May Wong, because this is a period in which you don't really, being Chinese American wasn't really a thing. If you were Chinese, they thought you were from China. Otherwise, if you're American, you must be like a white American and look like everyone else. So they couldn't understand this young woman. So, the headline here, Maid of Orient, unspoiled by success, dips her ivory hands in suds. They're talking about how she helps out at her dad's laundry, but a lot of reporters would go in expecting Anna May Wong to be like a Chinese maiden out of a book of poems. And then they would speak to her, and she spoke all the 1920s slang of all the young flappers, and she dressed like that too. And so it was a dissonant thing for them. They'd say, she opened her mouth and ruined it all. She ruined the illusion that she was this other thing. But I always love reading those articles, and you can see here later in her career in 1928, she is really like the flapper par excellence, dressed with her, her dress, the Mary Janes, the cloche hat, but she's slowly making her way into the films. There's a clip here from Dinty, which is one of her first credited roles that she plays at 15. And then there's two early films that are really important in her career. The first is The Toll of the Sea in 1922, which is actually the second Technicolor film ever made. And it leads to her getting cast in her first leading lady role at the age of 17. And so the thing that's really interesting about this film, it's a bit of a fluke, because unlike other Hollywood films, this one is actually being made by the scientists at Technicolor in collaboration with a Hollywood studio. And so the scientists really are creating a film to demonstrate the technology they've created. So they care less about box office names and more about being able to show off the color. So they've chosen a Chinese story. It's basically a Madame Butterfly tale that's been moved and set in China instead of Japan, because they want to make use of these lush backdrops, rich embroidered costumes, antiques, all sorts of brightly colored materials in the background. And they're also okay with casting Asian actors in Asian roles, unlike what they were normally doing, which was casting white actors in yellowface to play Asian roles, because they want the color to appear natural. So they cast Anna May Wong as well as some other Asian American actors in this film. And the other thing is that no one is expecting this to be a huge hit or anything like that. It's a Madame Butterfly tale, which has been done a million times, even in 1922. Norma Talmadge, Mary Pickford had already starred in films based on it. But Anna May Wong gives this virtuoso performance and basically blows everyone away. She's able to cry on cue in front of the cameras without the aid of glycerin or fake tears. And the New York Times reviewer gives her a rave review, says that, 9 times out of 10 with this story, all the performances are botched, but hers is the 10th performance, and that she deserves to be seen again and often. So of course, this gets her noticed by a lot of people in Hollywood, especially by Douglas Fairbanks, who is one of the biggest figures in early Hollywood. He's also producing his own films, and he's just about to cast his next blockbuster, which is an Arabian Nights tale called The Thief of Baghdad, and he's looking for exotic types. So he sees Anna May Wong, he sees her talents, and he casts her as the Mongol slave. As you can see here, she's very scantily clad, and that ends up becoming her unlikely breakout role, which launches her to international stardom because that film is seen around the world, and Anna May Wong becomes a name. So I'm going to play a short number of clips from some of her early silent films, including the last two that we just spoke about. stop it there. But I think you get a little bit of a taste of some of her early films, and also like the Thief of Baghdad moment, why it was so memorable, a little bit of slapstick. And since we're in Canada, I thought I would mention a little bit of a Canadian connection. So after Thief of Baghdad, Anna May Wong is getting a steady number of parts in various films. One of those films is called The Alaskan in 1924. So she's part of a film production crew, and Hollywood likes to cut corners. So instead of going all the way to Alaska, they decide they're going to come to Canada to film it instead. They actually go to Banff. So while they're on the way traveling up the West Coast in Seattle, they realize that not only is Anna May Wong part of their cast and crew, but they also have James Wong Howe, who later becomes an award-winning cinematographer, Chinese-American as well, first Asian-American to win an Oscar, which is a problem because we're living in the era of Chinese exclusion in the US, meaning that if you're a Chinese-American, even if you're an American-born citizen, your movements are tracked by the government. You have to have identity papers. You have to ask for permission to leave the country and to re-enter. And neither of them have the appropriate papers. So they're at the port of Seattle about to leave for Canada when they realize this. Don't know exactly what happens, but probably the studio threw its weight around, and they're able to get the appropriate paper so they can leave and go to Canada and shoot the film. But that's Anna May Wong's first real brush with the Chinese Exclusion Act, when she learns, oh, I have to have identity papers. So you'll see here that on the left that there's identity papers for her. They're issued to her at the port of Seattle, Washington in August of 1924. And then to the right, this document dates later from 1927, but it's an example of Form 430, which was the form you had to fill out as a Chinese American to apply to leave the country. So it would document your identity as well as sometimes like identifying characteristics or, a birthmark, a scar, and then upon re-entry, she would be interrogated and asked a number of questions about, her job, her profession, where she was born, and sometimes even shown photographs of her family and asked to identify them. So this is just another part of her reality as a Chinese American and as an actress. So she's getting all these parts in Hollywood films, but there's kind of a theme to them. She's always a bit player. A lot of times her scenes get cut or she's killed off in the film. Actually, there's an ad here for the Chinese Parrot, which was an early Charlie Chan film. And even though they're using Anna May Wong's image to advertise it, she actually dies. Even the film no longer exists, but we know that she dies in the very beginning, and she sets off the whole mystery that ensues. And then at the far right, we see a publicity still with her and Renee Adderey for the film Mr. Wu. And Renee is playing the female lead in Yellowface alongside Lon Chaney, also in Yellowface. Meanwhile, Anna May is in a much smaller supporting role, but she's still in the publicity stills, teaching Renee how to read Chinese, and sometimes it's teaching her how to use chopsticks. So this becomes a really frustrating experience for her. And part of the reason this is happening, because we did see The Toll of the Sea where she's playing opposite a white actor, but Hollywood is under a lot of pressure to kind of clean up their act. They've had the Fatty Arbuckle scandal, they've had a lot of racy films in the past, and the government has basically said, you need to stop producing these types of stories. So they essentially tell Anna May, sorry, we can't cast you in leading lady roles because you'll be opposite a white male actor, and that's interracial mixing, and we can't put it in our films. Or if we do, you can't have a happy ending. So this is a quote that she gives in an interview in 1928 that I think really exemplifies the situation she was in. And she says, "To tell the truth, I'm Chinese by race and I love Chinese people and things. My only regret is the limitation upon my work, as I can only play Oriental roles or sometimes Indian parts. Hayakawa's stardom failed because he was never allowed to kiss the heroine. The fans wouldn't have stood for it." And she's referring to Setsu Hayakawa, who is a Japanese actor, actually left. He was extremely successful. At one time, one of the most famous actors in the world, but left Hollywood in the 1920s because for these reasons in part. She goes on here in this kind of conversation, he says, well, no one objects to seeing an American kiss a pretty little Chinese girl, right? And she says, not if she is impersonated by an American, by a white woman in Yellowface. But Anna May, adds here, I think importantly, someday someone will write a story demanding a real Chinese girl, then perhaps I'll have my chance. So she's still optimistic. She's frustrated but optimistic. She feels like, I'm talented, there will be a role eventually. So something to remember. Around this time, she starts circulating with a lot of British and German expats in Hollywood, and she gets an offer to actually make a film in Berlin at UFA, which is the premier German studio at the time. And it's a starring role. The film will be written for her specifically. So she's 23 when this happens. The farthest away she's ever been from home is Canada. She doesn't speak any German, and she asks a lot of people what she should do. And many people advise her not to go. Like, this could be a career-ending move, right? You could leave and you'll come back and you'll not have a career in Hollywood anymore. So what does Anna May Wong do? She goes, because that's the kind of person she is. She's always willing to take a risk or bet on herself. So this photograph here is of her and her older sister Lulu. They're traveling together on their way to Europe. Then we also have a clipping from Mein Film, which is a German movie magazine. You see her leaving the train in Berlin. She's very happy, as the headline says, but she's happy because in Germany, they don't care about her race, or at least that's the line. And they're willing to put her in films that star her where she's opposite white actors. So here we see the poster for Song, which is the first film she makes in Germany, opposite Heinrich George, who was also previously in Metropolis. He's the love interest. And she doesn't have to fight with anyone for screen time in this film. It's actually really one of my favorites. Very melodramatic, but also beautifully shot. I mean, it captures the German expressionism of that period. And when it premieres in the summer of 1928, people love the film. I mean, she gets a standing ovation for 20 minutes, describes it as an out-of-body experience. And this pattern continues across the continent. So she goes to England. She also makes more films in Germany, one of which is filmed partly in France. She goes to England to make a film called Piccadilly. But you can see here, all the magazines and publications are just eating this up. They love her. And she's kind of influencing, trends as well. She's, modeling Chinese shawls and silk pajama sets. All the artists and photographers are lining up to capture her image. So it's a really wild time for her. And she ends up staying in Europe for almost 3 years. At one point, she gets an offer from someone home in LA to produce a film, and she very shrewdly decides to send her response to the letter to the Los Angeles Times, who print it. And she kind of says very diplomatically, "Oh, thank you so much for your offer. I don't think I'll be home before Christmas. I just had my film Song come out, which I had a standing, this rave review, and I'm making my debut in the live theater on the West End in London, and this and that, So it was her kind of way of saying the thanks but no thanks. But at the end of 3 years, Hollywood has kind of realized, maybe we messed up. Maybe we should give her another chance. Like, maybe she really is star worthy. So she comes back to the United States, sails back from Europe to New York. As soon as she gets off the boat, she's actually accosted by a Broadway producer who wants to put her in a new play called On the Spot. It's a Chicago gangland story, and the gang leader has a Chinese girlfriend, so they want her to play the part. She signs on the spot, and the play opens in 2 weeks on Broadway, so she has 2 weeks to prepare for this role, and it becomes a huge hit. She ends up staying in the show for 5 months and then traveling across the country. By the time she makes it back to Hollywood, it's already summer of 1931, and Paramount has offered her a two-picture deal, beginning with a starring vehicle called Daughter of the Dragon in 1931. They bring back Setsu Hayakawa to also star in it, and they've also brought in Warner Olin to play the Fu Manchu in Yellowface. She's playing the daughter of Fu Manchu. So while on the one hand, this is like her big starring moment in Hollywood, it's also somewhat misguided because Hollywood only knows what they think Asians can play on screen, and that's the Dragon Lady or the China Doll. And so this is like the literal China Doll, right? She's the daughter, not the literal China Doll, the literal Dragon Lady. She's the daughter of Fu Manchu, and she has to go murder people to avenge him. And so it's a really, it's campy in a bad way, I would say, but one of the things I do enjoy about this film is that they're giving her the star treatment. So Travis Banton, who's this Hollywood designer at Paramount, he's designed these incredible costumes for her, and there's so many different costume changes. So it's visually very beautiful to watch. Story, not so much. And this is also just a publicity still from the film with her autograph. Around this time, she also started autographing her photos with "Orientally Yours," so it was a bit of a wink to people. I mean, she understood that what set her apart was being Chinese, was being Asian. So she found ways to play that part of her identity up. So post Daughter of the Dragon, she's also in Shanghai Express with Marlene Dietrich, and that film is really Marlene's film, even though Anna May Wong gives an incredible performance. After that film, Paramount doesn't renew her contract. So there's these incredible highs and lows in her career. She goes to Europe, she's a huge star, Hollywood wants her back. They give her an opportunity, but they put her in this box and it doesn't do well. So then she's off the list again. So 1932 is actually a really rough year for her because there's actually a lot of things going on in Asia. I mean, there's a conflict between Japan and China, and there's a number of Chinese-themed films that are being made in Hollywood, but she doesn't get a role in any of those films. Most of them go to white actors in yellowface. So she writes about it to her friend Carl Van Vechten here. I made a test at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Studios for the leading role in The Sun Daughter. I guess I look too Chinese to play a Chinese because I hear Colleen Moore is going to do it. In the end, Helen Hayes played the role, as you see pictured here, along with Ramon Navarro, who is a Mexican actor playing the other Chinese male lead. Ramon was actually a friend of Anna May's, but he got cast in this film. So around this time, another important thing I'd like to talk about is The Good Earth, which was a novel written by Pearl S. Buck, daughter of American missionaries in China, who grew up in China, spoke Chinese fluently, was very, had a deep understanding of the culture, grew up in it. She ends up writing this very sympathetic novel about two Chinese peasant farmers, Wang Long and O Lan, and Americans are so startled when they read it. They don't remember that the characters are Chinese. They seem so relatable, so, human. So it becomes a huge bestseller, and it wins the Pulitzer. Irving Thalberg, who's the boy wonder at MGM at the time, he sees this and he decides that he's going to make a big epic film adaptation of this book and pays a lot of money for it. Supposedly it was the most amount of money paid for a screen adaptation at the time. So now, thinking back to what Anna May Wong said earlier, someday, someone will write a story demanding a real Chinese girl, and then perhaps I'll have my chance. So everyone thinks this is the moment she's been waiting for, right? I mean, all of her friends in the Hollywood media, they're placing her name. Who should play the lead of Olan? Probably should be Anna May Wong, right? She's the only Chinese actress that we know. Of course, that's not what happens. Instead, MGM cast two European actors in the lead roles. First, they cast Paul Muni in Wang Long's part, and they use that as an excuse to say to Anna May, sorry, you can't play opposite a white male, even though he's impersonating a Chinese character. The logic of this, there's no logic to it. So then they cast Louise Reiner, who's a German actress, and she's only really been in the US for about a year at this point. She's still learning English. But they cast her in the role. At the same time, they're making these huge efforts to present an authentic, sympathetic portrait of the Chinese. They've sent all these scouts to China to buy up farms as props. They're studying the hairstyles, the dress, all of these different customs. I mean, I've gone through these booklets of information at the Academy Library. They're even bragging, and as you see in this ad, about their realistic yellow face makeup. That they're making such efforts to do this in a real way. So you kind of see the hypocrisy. They just can't bring themselves to cast Asian actors in the main roles. So they ask Anna May back to audition for a supporting role. In the end, she decides that she's not going to be in this film. And instead, she kind of makes a bold statement and says, instead of being in this film, I'm actually going to take my first trip to China. And if you want to see what China is really about, you can come along with me. So she's producing this counter-narrative. She does a series of articles chronicling her experiences, her impressions as an American traveling to China for the New York Herald Tribune, which are syndicated across the country. She also has a cameraman, Newsreel Wong, who comes along and documents parts of her travels, which are sent home as newsreels, but she later makes that into a documentary, which she narrates herself. And you see here, I mean, there's some photographs here of her arriving in Shanghai. She also spends a lot of time in Beijing, which she really loves. She loves the walled gardens there, especially the moon gates. That later becomes important when she builds a home in Santa Monica. She builds a moon gate into it and names it Moon Gate. I also really love the photo in the bottom right corner, which is of her in the countryside going out to speak with actual Chinese farmers. So in my book, I actually spend a lot of time on the film The Good Earth, because for me, it was like a split screen moment where you could watch Anna May go on her own journey to China and see what that was really like. And then you can see all the ridiculousness of how Hollywood interprets China, how it fabricates its own version of it. And there's some really interesting juxtapositions that come out of that, such as casting Chinatown extras in your film who've never actually been to China, having a Chinese translator, an English to Chinese translator on set who, when the extras themselves already speak English and don't need the translation, things like that. But she goes to China, has a life-changing experience. She's there for 10 months, comes back, a changed woman. She's actually received a lot of criticism in China. People there have said, why did you make all these films that made us look bad? You weren't wearing any clothes. I mean, a lot of her films weren't even shown in China. They were banned outright. So a lot of people are upset with her, even though she didn't really have control over the types of roles that she took. But she takes everything that they say in stride. She comes back to the US, and then she says very publicly, Hollywood won't cast Chinese actors in Chinese roles. And that's her way of saying, Hollywood is racist, which I think is a really courageous thing to do in the 1930s. I mean, I can't think of anyone else who was saying something like that. And the incredible thing is that she doesn't get blacklisted. She actually turns this into a new opportunity for herself, because she's also realized while she was in China, because she met her friend Warner Olin, the Swedish actor who played Fu Manchu, but also is famous for playing Charlie Chan. She realized that when he went to China, the Chinese loved him. They embraced him because they like Charlie Chan. He's a positive role model. He's a detective. He solves crimes. So she comes back to Paramount and says, why can't I play a female Chinese detective? And so they don't exactly give her a detective series, but they do give her a series of B movies that are lower budget, but she can have more influence over them. And she's always playing the heroine, who is essentially solving crimes of different kinds. So the first of these films is Daughter of Shanghai in 1937 with Philip Ahn, Korean-American actor, and he was actually her childhood friend. They grew up together on the same street. When she was first getting success as an actress, she bought herself a nice car, but she didn't know how to drive it. So Philip would drive her around in the car. He used to drive her to the set of The Thief of Baghdad before, she could drive. He would pick her up, drive her there, pick her up. So they went really far back, and this was their chance to work together. They're playing the heroines in this film. Philip Ahn is actually playing an FBI agent, which someone noted to me is probably a couple decades before a real Asian American became an FBI agent. So I think that's really visionary that she did that in this film. And all the villains are played by white actors. So she completely flipped the script. And unlike her earlier films where she often had to die in the end, she gets a happy ending. She and the Philip Ahn character end up together happily at the end. They're in the back of a car and he asks her to marry him. Very sweet. Another film from this period that I also really love is King of Chinatown from 1939. It's a fictional biopic of Dr. Margaret Chung, who was the first Chinese-American woman to become a doctor and was really involved with the Flying Tigers and China Aid during the war, during World War II. And Anna May and her were friends. So this is really in homage to her. I think one of the reasons I like it is it has a lot of slices of life of Chinese-American life. You see Anna May playing this modern surgeon, but her father runs an herbal shop. During Chinese New Year, she invites her colleagues from the hospital home for the dinner. So there's little scenes like that I also think are pretty revolutionary for like 1930s films. I don't know if anyone was noticing what she was doing. But so that's just snapshot of, what she did with her career, the ways it changed. I mean, there were a lot of ups and downs and more that happened after, the 1930s, certainly. But just to give you a little taste of all the things that she accomplished, she was the first woman of color to play a leading role in a Hollywood film, and that was The Toll of the Sea. First Chinese-American movie star. She might have been cinema's first interracial kiss in a British film called Java Head in 1934. And then with Philip Ahn in Daughter of Shanghai, they became the first Asian American actors to play a leading romantic couple in the sound era. And then finally, this photograph actually is a behind-the-scenes shot from a television series that she made in the 1950s called The Gallery of Madame Liu Song, which was about a woman who has a art gallery and travels around the world solving art crimes. The tapes are unfortunately lost, but that did make her the first Asian American to lead a television show. So, an incredible woman, so many firsts. That is, kind of my Anna May Wong's life in a nutshell. Of course, I've written a book about her, which has much more in detail, and I'm happy to sign copies afterwards. I also write a newsletter called Half Caste Woman, which has a lot of the research that didn't make it into the book, and because I'm still learning things about her every day, so I like to kind of do deep dives into various episodes in her life, and you can also follow me on social media. Thank you.
Okay, so I'd love to moderate a Q&A portion of this conversation. That was an amazing presentation and so enjoyable. Thank you, Katie. I might just ask the first question, if that's okay, to kick things off, take advantage of my role as moderator. I'm so always curious about actors and what they think about their own roles. And as you mentioned, Anna May didn't have a lot of choice, in these tokenized roles that she was offered, like the only ones that were offered in Hollywood. Mm-hmm. But I wonder if she was aware of the kind of the tropes and the cliches and the racial stereotypes, and if she reflected on that in any kind of agential way that you came across, because there's a book about Philip Ahn, probably you've read this actually.
Hollywood Asian.
Yes, where the author talks about how when Philip Ahn was cast as like the Japanese villain, he would speak Korean. He would, do this kind of subversive thing where he was actually, and they didn't know, like the filmmakers had no idea.
Right.
They're just like, it just sounds Asian, fine.
Right. Well, I also heard that he relished those roles because he wanted to vilify the Japanese, because his father was a leader of the Korean independence movement and died in a prison in Japan. So, so I have heard those stories. So Anna May, I think that there is certainly an evolution in her thinking about it. She started making films at 14. So I think in those early years, as you see, she's playing those kind of stereotypical roles, the Mongol slave and, not wearing a lot of clothing, or she's kind of, cast as a floozy very often. So in those early days, I think she was just happy to be working. I don't think she thought that much about it. But, certain that she gets frustrated when she's pigeonholed into those roles. And I think, with each film and each turn with Hollywood where things don't end well, she's getting more and more frustrated and realizing, why did they always put me in these roles? And so there are interviews, for example, after the whole Daughter of the Dragon episode, and Paramount doesn't renew her contract, she goes back to Europe, and she gives an interview in England and says, I didn't think I was going to make any more films. But then in Britain, they offer her some roles like Java Head, where she is playing in an interracial couple and gets a kiss, right? That was a groundbreaking thing. But she talks about, why is it that all of the Chinese roles are always villains? We're not actually like that in real life. So why is it that they always portray us that way? And so I think and then the big break really happens when she goes to China and comes back, right? Because when she's in China, the nationalist government invites her to a banquet, which is kind of a trap, because they just spend the whole banquet criticizing her for hours. And so she's really been put through the ringer and told, how can, people are really mad at her. But she's taking it seriously, right? And So with these films, from various articles and things, she does talk about the things that she changed. For example, in one of them, they asked her to wear a sarong, and she says, no, no Chinese girl would wear a sarong. I'm not wearing a sarong. She changes something like, they always wanted her to refer to her father, honorable father, as if that was something you do when you're Chinese. And so she gets that removed. And there's actually a really cute scene between her and her screenfather in King of Chinatown where they're speaking like normal Americans. And I actually put that dialogue in the book because I thought it was also a nod to her own relationship with her father. But yeah, I think that there was certainly an evolution over time, and I think she did what she could when she could to impact things. I mean, with Shanghai Express, her and her brother actually went through the script and tried to make changes. I don't know what those were or if they were made to the film, but it was something that she tried to do. Whether she was, successful in those efforts, it's hard to say, but it was something that more and more throughout her career she was thinking about.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions from the audience? I'm just going to pass this to you guys because we're recording.
I wanted to see if you could ask you to say some more about Daughter of Shanghai and the sort of levels of irony, right? Because of course in that film she's a daughter of California, and the plot is about hysteria about illegal immigration.
Yes.
And she is involved in fact defending the United States from these illegal immigrants coming from outside as an American figure, right? And yet she's not. The title of the film, others her. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about that interesting film because it's such a neat film.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that the project started Untitled, just being the Anna May Wong project, and then there were some other titles I can't quite remember what they were, but Daughter of Shanghai, yeah, I think it is just like probably what the studio wanted because it sounds exotic. I can't even remember if she goes to Shanghai. Maybe that's where she is when she goes to this port city.
She's in San Francisco, I think.
No, it's not San Francisco because she goes somewhere to be a dancer undercover.
Mexico. It's Mexico.
Okay, it's someplace else. I don't think it's Shanghai, but there's this idea that there's an immigration ring. So I think the whole immigrant narrative, it's a little complicated because she's trying to do it in a way that is not vilifying immigrants. And if you watch the film, I think it portrays the immigrants as helpless victims of this crime, this illegal crime ring, it's trafficking human beings run by white people. So those are the true villains. But it is a weird narrative because it's basically they're trafficking immigrants in almost to work as like indentured servants, and they're trying to get these local businesses, they're trying to strong arm them into hiring the immigrants that they're bringing in. Like nobody wants these people actually. So it doesn't actually parallel reality because I think in reality there are, there would have, I assume as there were in, the 90s and more recently, Chinese traffickers who are bringing Chinese immigrants to the U.S., right, promising them passage, all that kind of thing. So that's not the story here. She's tried to change it in a way that doesn't quite make sense, but obviously I don't think the public really knew that anyways, but she's twisting it in a way so that the villains are these rich white people. So then you can kind of see the intention there is actually very clear, right? And the funny thing that other people have mentioned to me too is that there is one other ally they have who is like the Irish chauffeur. And it's like kind of like the working class immigrants unite against the.
So the rich old white lady in the house is an art collector. It's a great villain.
Yes, she has all of these antiques from Asia, right? Yeah. So it is.
Sinophile.
Yeah, and they also kind of advertise this film as like ripped from the headlines. It's in the script. It's in the beginning. They flash all these like illegal trafficking ring, whatever, blah blah blah. So she's trying to tap into something, but twisted in a way that actually promotes a positive image of Asians. Yeah.
Any other questions? Oh,
I just wanted to ask about, it's clear you put a lot of archival work to unearth a lot of this. Could you say a little bit about some of the archives you visited and where you were finding a lot of this information about her? Were they associated with like the cinemas at the time, or were you working in more personal archives?
Great question. Well, so Anna May Wong doesn't have personal papers, unfortunately, at least not any that we know of. I mean, maybe they'll turn up one day. She does have a small collection of correspondence with Carl Van Vechten at Yale, and that's actually one of the first things that I went and looked at. But yeah, I drew from a lot of different resources. So when I started this book, it was during the pandemic. So in the beginning, I had to do a lot of digital research. I mean, luckily, a lot of things have been digitized. So there's the Media History Library online. That's a great source for movie magazines. So there's a ton of things on there, and there's international sources. I also spent a lot of time in online newspaper archives, so newspapers.com, San Francisco Chronicle, which has the LA Examiner, which no longer exists. So a lot of different online archives. I had to start there, and then also go to like biographies and memoirs of some of her Hollywood contemporaries. Once things opened again, there's a lot of different places you can go looking for things. I mean, one of the things I did need to do was go see her European films, which until recently hadn't been restored or digitized. So I had to go to London to BFI to watch some of the European films. I mean, it's such a weird thing to write about films that you haven't seen. And it totally changes once you see them because it's a different thing. So I went there to do that. Once it finally opened up, I went to the Academy Library in Beverly Hills. I was there for a month. So I went through not only files related to Anna May Wong, but I went through files related to all of her films, and I went through files for The Good Earth, and I went through files for Flower Drum Song, which she was supposed to be in, but she died before that happened. There's an infinite number of things there that you could go through, which is why I was there for a month. And I could have stayed longer. I went to Berkeley, where they have an archive of Chinese movie magazines. There are things at the New York Public Library, UCLA, USC. So it's really spread out across many different archives. I also, when I could, even though Anna May Wong has been dead for more than 60 years, there were still some people alive who knew her, including actually one of her tenants at her home in Santa Monica. He just passed this year at 103. I corresponded with him. I corresponded with Marlene Dietrich's daughter. So there were a handful of people who I went to as well, and either corresponded with or did interviews with them. The other thing I should mention is there's still a very robust fan base for Anna May Wong, and they're amateur sleuths. They find stuff. They have their own collections. They find stuff all the time, and so I also learn things through them. It's kind of a never-ending. I still, like I said earlier, I still learn new things about her every day.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
It was a great talk. I was wondering, some of the Caucasian actors and who played Asians, how did they feel about it? Did they write about it? Did they feel resigned or proud or depressed?
That's a great question. I don't know if you've ever watched Arthur Dong's documentary. I think it's called Hollywood Chinese. And he interviews some people. He interviews Louise Reiner, who played the role in The Good Earth. She was pretty defiant. I think I quoted her in the book because she says, "Why can't, it's that artistic thing. I should be allowed to play anyone, that's what an actor does." I think some other actors were a little less, were more apologetic about it.
At the time, or?
In hindsight. Warner Oland, the Swedish actor, so he's a really interesting case because I think, and he was friends with Anna May. They were in a lot of films together, so they were friendly. He was actually a really erudite guy. He had originally, he used to do theater in Sweden, he and his wife, and I think they were the first to translate Strindberg into English. And then somehow he got mixed up in the movies. And then little by little, he was getting put into villain roles, and then they started realizing, oh, your eyes naturally look kind of Asian. We could put you, and you have dark hair. We could put you in Asian roles without a lot of makeup. And then he became very successful. I mean, he made a lot of money. I think he owned 5 homes. He owned like an island or something. I mean, he was incredibly rich. But I think that he became trapped in the Charlie Chan role because people said that he still looked like Charlie Chan even when he wasn't making the films, like it was him. And when he was at home with just his wife, he started speaking like Charlie Chan. And supposedly the story, because so Key Luke, a Chinese American actor, he was number 1 son in a lot of those films, and they were very close. And he writes very fondly of Warner Holland. I mean, I think they must have been very close. He writes very fondly about him, but he kind of jokes and says, yeah, well, Warner, he used to take a swig of whiskey or something so that he would slur his words so he could have that like sing-songy accent. But it became a habit, and he became a very serious alcoholic. He stopped showing up on time. He would just disappear. And the last Charlie Chan film he was making, in the middle of it, he just walked off the set. He basically needed a break. He ended up going back to Sweden to revisit his homeland, and then he died of pneumonia there. So I feel like the part actually like cursed him. That's my personal opinion. So.
I have like 2 questions basically. Like one is does like Anna May Wong how she identifies herself if I'm the first like Asian American like actress or something, then I will feel like I have like very difficult time like identifying myself as like Chinese or like as American, like especially when I like doing actor business. Yeah, and the other thing is I was quite shocked at how she was treated differently in Europe and in like Hollywood. I thought that like it's the other way, but instead she's treated like worse in Hollywood. Then that's my thought.
Yeah, so first question, I think it was difficult for her to identify herself to others. And I do think that she saw herself as Chinese American, but it meant something a little bit different then than what it means now. I mean, people always saw her as connected to China, which I think it was so important for her to actually go there, because it's like you say that I'm this thing and I don't know what that thing is. I've never been there, right? So and then once she goes, she has a much deeper connection to it and actually spends the early 40s fundraising for China Aid during World War II. But it was a difficult thing. I mean, she says she has written some memoir pieces and said, about her early childhood, she thought she was just like any other American kid. So it wasn't until people started treating her differently, calling her names because she was Chinese, that she started to understand that that was something different, right? And then even later in her career, sometimes they'd have some function in the Hollywood that had like all the foreign actors, and they would include Anna May Wong, but she wasn't actually foreign, but they consider, she represents China. And she understood that when she goes to China, they think that she represents them too, right? Even though she wasn't born there. And her Chinese is not very good. So there's this expectation from everyone that she represents them. And so it's kind of an impossible position for her, but I think she did the best that she could with it, given the circumstances. To your second question, remind me, what was the second question?
Like, she was treated like so differently from...
Oh, yes. Yeah, what can I say except that America was a really racist place at that time. It was everything that you did in public was according to the rules of like race and class and a specific hierarchy. So one of the reasons, she was friends with Paul Robeson, who was a famous black actor, and even though I don't have a lot of information about their friendship, one of the reasons I kept his story in is because I wanted you to also compare what it was like for him in the US versus what it was like for her, because it was certainly bad for her. I mean, people would fling slurs at her on the street, that kind of thing. But for Paul Robeson as a black man, he was doing theater in Greenwich Village in New York City, and there was almost nowhere he could go and sit down and have lunch because they wouldn't serve him because he was black. And that's like he would have to go to Harlem, or maybe there was like one place in Times Square he could go. So it makes it impossible for you to live as a public person. Like, what are you supposed to do? And so you can't even eat someplace, let alone be in a show or a movie. So it makes sense why they would go to Europe. And then in Europe, at that time, there wasn't a lot of immigration from other places. I mean, there are almost no Chinese people in Germany when she went there. So it's not that there wasn't racism, but it was a different kind. They're really fascinated in her as this like rare species, like something you would put in a zoo, right? Oh, it's so fascinating. And there also during that time, there was like the primitivism was kind of a trend. They're really interested in African and Asian and like, so-called savage cultures. So Josephine Baker is there and very successful in France. So it's like the other side of racism, right? It's the fascination, the intrigue, not the hatred.
I was going to say Josephine Baker. We just talked about it in our celebrity studies class, but she also she didn't have a illustrious career in the U.S. She had to go to Europe where these kind of racialized fascinations and fantasies played out through her career. Yeah. There's a hand here, I think.
Yes.
First. Yeah.
Okay. I guess I was just wondering if you could maybe say more about Shanghai Express, because that was kind of, that was, in a way you're right that it is Marlene Dietrich's film, but I remember that was how I was introduced to Anna May when I watched that, and I remember she was the one who really stood out to me, and I remember thinking, why can't this film be about her? If I'm not wrong, she actually saves the day by killing the villain.
Yes.
So I guess, I don't know, I was just wondering if you had any more thoughts or insights into maybe how her role in the film kind of sits alongside its portrayal of China, or how it sits alongside the positioning of Marlena's character as the lead, I guess.
Yeah, great question. I mean, Shanghai Express is a great film, and probably Anna May's best Hollywood film. I think at the time that it was made, there weren't Oscar awards for supporting actresses, but I feel like if there had been, I don't know, she'd be nominated, but she was at least deserving of a nomination for that role. So, I mean, yeah, she is, in my opinion, she is the hero of that film. And there's a whole chapter in the book that's about Shanghai Express, about the making of it. I think the other interesting dynamic is between her and Marlene Dietrich. And so you have to go back a little bit, because they first meet in Germany around 1930 when they're all making film. So Anna May Wong, there's a famous photograph of Marlene Dietrich, Anna May Wong, and Leni Riefenstahl at this costume ball in 1930 in Berlin. And all three of them were making films at UFA at the time. And actually, Marlene had just made The Blue Angel, which is the film that kind of launched her career, with Joseph von Sternberg. So at the time that photograph was taken, Anna May Wong was actually the most famous woman in it, but then later things changed. I mean, Marlene goes to Hollywood. So Joseph von Sternberg, works with her. He's completely obsessed with her. She becomes his muse. He gets her this huge contract in Paramount, and no one in Hollywood has ever even seen one of her films. And they bring her there, give her they pull out all the stops for her and make her a star overnight. Of course, we all know what Leni Riefenstahl ends up doing. She becomes, makes documentaries for Hitler. But anyway, so by the time that they're making Shanghai Express, the tables have kind of turned, right? Their positions have completely changed. Now Marlene Dietrich is the huge Hollywood star, and Anna May is her supporting actress, right? So it's kind of a bit of a come down. So other previous biographers have, claimed that they potentially had some type of sexual romantic relationship. I never found any evidence of that. And instead, what I really see is that they were professional rivals, because you're right. Anna May almost outshines her, and it's a Marlene Dietrich film. I mean, Marlene is still fabulous in it. But there's a scene that I put in my book where supposedly Marlene, invites another German friend to go see an early screening with her, like in a private screening room of Shanghai Express. And, she's kind of self-deprecatingly making fun of herself because her eyes, she keeps, like in the film, she keeps looking this way, that way. And then her friend says, that Chinese girl, she's really good. And then supposedly, it was just silence, So, and if you read Marlene Dietrich's own autobiography, she doesn't even mention Shanghai Express or Anna May Wong. And so that to me says that she didn't want to mention it because it's that film where this other actress is really good and makes her look bad. Yeah, so there's a lot of stuff that's going on in that film, like in front of the camera, but also behind the scenes.
I think maybe you were first, and then was go to Barry. Is it okay?
My question was that quote where she says, "I hope there's a script that where they need a Chinese girl, and I hope that's me." Did she ever get to play a role like that? And if not, did she fulfill that dream of hers through one of her own productions that she was having a lot of influence over?
Yeah, so I would say that she made that come true for herself with those Paramount films in the late 1930s, because she's playing heroes, right? And they're all films that really try to put Chinese Americans in a positive light. And that, that really was her own doing, because the way that she, I forgot to put this in my presentation or say it this way, when she goes to Paramount and says, why can't I do these films? The way she actually does it is she has lunch with an executive at Paramount, and she says, well, I have this idea that I should do, female version of Charlie Chan. What studios do you think I should pitch it to? Meaning not you, but the other studio. So then he immediately says, oh no, well, why aren't you pitching it to us? We'll do it right now. So I think it's just a testament to her resiliency that she had, how many rejections she'd gotten in her career, and she kept trying until she, got what she wanted.
Thank you. I have a question about, I think people will appreciate the Walter Benjamin scene in the book. So I just wondered if you wanted to tell that story of their meeting. It's so juicy.
Sure, yeah. So after she arrives in Berlin in 1928, she's kind of embraced by all these intellectuals and artists there. And so she goes to this party at a private home, and Walter Benjamin is there. And he's just so smitten with her. He wants her all to himself. So he's like, let's go to the other room so I can actually talk to you. And they have this kind of interview, and he's asking her all these questions about how she grew up and about her craft as an actor. And he ends up writing it all up for a newspaper in Germany. And so it kind of lives on. I mean, it just shows you the level of obsession with her that this famous philosopher is, kind of at his knees in front of Anna May Wong. I mean, he talks about also how she was playing with her hair, or she let her hair down, and you could tell he kind of got a thrill from that. So yeah, it's a really lovely episode. And actually, there's a filmmaker, Yuna Hong. She made a documentary about Anna May Wong, but she's been working on a short feature about that meeting. So I think maybe she'll have it out next year. But yeah, I'd love to see that.
So I'm old-fashioned. I was wondering how her parents felt about her early career being scantily clad. And two, how supportive were they? They must have been very proud of her at the end, but there must be some times when they were really uncomfortable with what she was doing.
Yeah, I mean, they were definitely uncomfortable with what she was doing. They did not want her to be in movies. I mean, but you also have to understand it. No parent at that time wanted anyone to be in movies because it wasn't a reputable industry. It wasn't anything. It was this weird trend that they thought would be here today, gone tomorrow. But the thing was, she started making these films. She's bringing home money. And she's contributing to the family. So, her dad kind of, well, okay, that's fine. You're going to contribute to the family. She sends all of her brothers to college. I don't have the actual records of this, but I believe that she bought property that many of them lived in. She paid for a lot of things. Like, actually, when she realizes she needs identity papers, the first thing when she comes home is she takes all of her siblings on a trip to Tijuana, or not to Tijuana, but to Mexico, across the border, so that they can establish their identity papers. So she was constantly, she was really dedicated to her family. But that said, there always was a push and pull between her and her father, especially. She was stubborn, he was stubborn. I think there were often threats that he was going to marry her off. Wanted to see her married, to have children. Her mother, on the other hand, I think just didn't understand what it was. Like, she was superstitious. She felt that the camera would steal her soul. She had her photo taken, which is, actually true in a figurative way, right? And the other sad thing is that while she was on Broadway, her mother died, got hit by a car, and she didn't go home for the funeral because she would have probably been out of the show if she had left. So there were a lot of difficult moments between her and her family, I'm sure. But, she loved them dearly, and they were very close, I think, until she died. And then that kind of, who got the money from her estate kind of divided everyone. But, I think on some level her father was proud of her, maybe not totally understanding what it is that she did in life. There are, various references in her films, the later films. That's why I like King of Chinatown, because she has this kind of rapport with her father, her screen father, and I feel like that is a kind of stand-in for her real father. And then there is just one funny little anecdote about her father going to see The Thief of Baghdad, and he comes out of the theater and they ask him, Dad, what did you think of the film? And apparently he just was like, brr, feels cold, because you're not wearing any clothes. So that was his kind of snide feedback. Yeah. I did just want to mention, I forgot to say earlier, in case anyone wants a postcard, I have these postcards that I made using AI art that reimagine Anna May Wong in various Hollywood films, Pulp Fiction. This is actually The Good Earth that she was never in, Titanic. So if you'd like to take a postcard afterwards, feel free to do so. Yeah.
That's amazing. I was hoping to ask about, because you've been writing for publications that ask you to kind of talk about the kind of contemporary implications of revisiting Anna May Wong, but then there's also other things like Cloud Atlas had yellow face.
Sure,
there was a controversy around there. There's lots of whitewashing of Asian characters. There's all of this. And I guess this is a bit abstract, but if you can speak to some of the ways in which the contemporary moment in pop culture, really speaks to a lot of these things you've discovered, and that there's a continuum actually of the same problems, or I don't know.
Yeah, no, I do think there is a continuum of the same problems. I think the problem is that producers and studios don't want to put certain people in starring roles because they don't think it will make money. They don't think that people want to see them, which I don't think is true, and which I think we're starting to see is not true. But in Anna May Wong's time, that was the assumption. I don't know if you've seen James Hong's speech at the SAG Awards a couple of years ago when Everything Everywhere All at Once won. He started making films with Clark Gable just in the background, and he said, Hollywood says, Asians aren't box office. And that is really the attitude, it's not going to sell films. But with Anna May Wong, it's well, then how could she be this successful without your help, without anyone trying to make her into a star? A lot of other Hollywood stars, they were made. But Anna May Wong, she did it all on her own, and she, was getting 500 fan letters a week. People would write into magazines, complain that they didn't put her in the starring role and instead put a white actress. Like, why wouldn't you put Anna May Wong in the role? So people, because that is one of the excuses we give in the modern era. We say, oh, she was before her time. People weren't ready for her, and it's actually, people were fine with it. They wanted to see her. It was the people in power, the gatekeepers, who didn't want to make those decisions, and that's still true today. And the only reason it's changed, well, is because Crazy Rich Asians was incredibly profitable, and that made people realize, oh, well, maybe we can put Asians in films and they will sell. But even with that, I mean, you have a lot of the decision makers. There's like maybe one Asian person in the room helping make those decisions. Like, it's not just happening on its own. And I think the other thing too to recognize is that even though there's been a little bit of a renaissance with a lot of different Asian actors having more visibility, we're seeing more, Asian stories being told, but a lot of times it's like specifically that whole series or film or whatever is like an Asian story. It's not like a Canadian story or an American story. It's like, oh, it's just an Asian story. It's like something, it's not, and that's kind of why I like put her in these films, because it's like, why, let me see if I can find, I think I put her like in, why couldn't an Asian woman play the lead in Titanic, Why couldn't she be Wonder Woman? Like, we don't see that happening. So we're not to that point yet where they're willing to cast an Asian actor in a leading role in like a big blockbuster film that has nothing to do with Asians. It's just a story.
I don't know where the microphone has done.
That reminds me of another question. What do you make then of her appearance in Ryan Murphy's Counterfactual? I mean, there you go.
It's difficult to watch. I mean, I'm not a huge Ryan Murphy fan, so let's just say that. Not my style. I think it's misleading, unfortunately. Like, I think the intentions were good, and I think that Michelle Krusik did a good job of trying to channel her, but because if you haven't watched the show, it's a Netflix series about the 1930s Hollywood, and there is a character that's Anna May Wong, and they try to give her her flowers by giving her a role in a film that then wins her an Oscar. And in real life, that never happened, right? And so I actually think it's more important that she never won an Oscar. She was never even nominated for an Oscar, and she didn't get to redo The Good Earth, because when you think that it's all resolved, it's like, oh, well, that's fine then, But yeah, so I think it's, I think it's a little problematic.
Cheesy.
Yeah, cheesy.
This is more of a personal question, is how did you find out about her, and why does she mean so much to you that you would know so much about her?
Great question. So I learned about Anna May Wong 20 years ago. I was doing my first college internship at the Chinese American Museum in Los Angeles. And on my first day on the job, I was given a tour of the museum, and they had a bunch of black and white photos, and one of them was Anna May Wong. And I didn't know who she was, but her image captivated me, even though it was a pretty, as far as portraits of Anna May Wong go, this is not a very glamorous image. It's pretty ordinary, but I was like, oh my God, who was that? And how did she exist in the 1930s? And so when it was explained to me who she was, I was just like, wow, that's incredible. I'm part Chinese. My mother grew up in Chinatown in Los Angeles, so there were a lot of similarities between her family story. My family is also from Toisan in southern China, and been here for been in the U.S. for several generations. My mom, I think in many ways was like Anna May Wong, stubborn, independent, kind of a rebel. So there were a lot of overlap that I think that drew me to her, but it was also just this idea that how could someone like her exist and we not know about her today? And nobody, anyone I asked about her didn't know who she was. So I felt like that was a huge injustice, and yeah, it just stuck with me for 20 years and compelled me to